An elderly couple pretended to go on vacation, then watched their house and froze. They loaded empty suitcases into the car. They waved goodbye to the neighbors. They drove 4 blocks to a motel room and sat down in front of a laptop showing 4 hidden camera feeds of their own home. The suitcase was empty. Not almost empty, not lightly packed. Completely, deliberately, theatrically empty. Helen Garza lifted it with one hand and carried it to the front porch like it weighed 40 pounds, grunting for the benefit of Mrs. Calloway across the street, who was already stationed at her window with a cup of tea and no shame about watching. "Get the blue one too, Walt," Helen called back into the house. "And don't forget your swim trunks." There were no swim trunks. There was no trip. Walter Garza, 73 years old with a bad knee and a worse poker face, appeared in the doorway holding a second empty suitcase. He grimaced, shifting it from one hand to the other, acting like he was lugging cinder blocks. "We're going to miss the flight," he said, loud enough for the whole cul-de-sac. There was no flight either. Helen loaded the suitcases into the trunk of their Ford Taurus with a practiced slowness, letting every neighbor who cared to look get a good, clear view. Walt locked the front door, jiggled the handle twice the way he always did, then walked down the porch steps with a performance of carefree retirement that almost fooled even Helen. Almost. His hands were shaking. They backed out of the driveway of 26 Meadow Lane at 8:47 on a Saturday morning in early November. Waving at the Calloway's window, honking once at Frank DeLuca, who was dragging his recycling bin to the curb, Helen even rolled down her window as they passed the Andersons' house. 2 weeks in Sarasota, she called out to nobody in particular. "Doctor said Walt needs the sun," Frank waved without looking up. The Calloway curtain twitched, and then they were gone, except they weren't. 4 blocks south. Helen turned the Taurus into the parking lot of the Comfort Lodge on Birch Street, a forgettable motel wedged between a tire shop and a sandwich place that had changed names 3 times in 2 years. Walt had already paid cash for a ground-floor room the day before, using a name he hadn't used since the Army. The room smelled like bleach and floral air freshener fighting each other to a draw. The carpet was the color of something you'd rather not think about. 2 queen beds, a TV bolted to the dresser, a bathroom with a sliding door that didn't quite close. Home for the next 14 days. Walt set the empty suitcases in the corner and sat on the edge of the bed with the look of a man who still wasn't sure this was a good idea. Helen was already pulling the real luggage from the back seat, not clothes and toiletries. 2 laptops, a bundle of cables, a battery backup, a notebook with 3 months of handwritten observations, and a portable Wi-Fi hotspot she'd bought at the electronics store using their granddaughter's old ID. "You think they bought it?" Walt asked. Helen plugged in the first laptop and opened it. The screen filled with 4 live camera feeds, each one showing a different angle of their home on Meadow Lane. Front porch, backyard, side gate. And the last one? Angled just right to catch the edge of their driveway and the street beyond, reaching all the way to the Calloway house and the dark mouth of the alley between the DeLuca and Anderson properties. "I think," Helen said, pulling a chair close and sitting down, "that we're about to find out." The Garzas had lived at 26 Meadow Lane for 31 years. They'd raised 2 daughters in that house. Walt had built the back deck himself over the course of 3 summers. Helen had planted the hydrangeas along the front walkway, nursed them through droughts and ice storms, and watched them bloom every June like clockwork. That house wasn't just where they lived. It was the physical record of their marriage, their parenthood, their whole adult lives. The neighborhood had been good once. Working families mostly. People who mowed on Saturdays and waved when you drove past. The kind of street where someone would notice if your newspaper sat too long on the porch, and they'd check on you. Not out of nosiness, but because that's what neighbors did. But things had changed. It started small. Little things that Helen noticed because Helen noticed everything. She'd been a bookkeeper for 34 years at a plumbing supply company. Numbers, patterns, things that didn't add up. That was her whole professional life, and she carried it into retirement the way some people carry reading glasses. Always looking, always counting, always filing things away in a mind that refused to slow down just because her body had. The first thing she noticed was the cars. About a year ago, unfamiliar vehicles began appearing on Meadow Lane late at night. Not visitors, not rideshare drivers. Cars that would park at odd angles near the DeLuca house or the empty lot at the end of the cul-de-sac, sit with their engines running for 10-15 minutes, then leave, always between 1 and 4 in the morning, always different cars. Helen mentioned it to Walt, who shrugged and said it was probably kids. She mentioned it to Frank DeLuca, who said he hadn't noticed anything. She mentioned it to Mrs. Calloway, who changed the subject with suspicious speed. The second thing she noticed was the lights. The Anderson house, which had belonged to a quiet couple named Pete and Donna Anderson for as long as the Garzas had lived there, went dark in a way that didn't make sense. Pete and Donna had moved to Arizona 4 months earlier, and their son, Keith, had taken over the property. He said he was renting it out, but the pattern of lights was wrong. Rooms that should have been bedrooms stayed dark all night. Rooms that should have been storage lit up at 2 in the morning, and the glow wasn't the warm yellow of living. It was the blue-white flicker of something else entirely. Third, and this was the one that really got under Helen's skin, things started happening to their property. Small things at first. The garden hose was moved from where she'd coiled it. The gate latch, which Walt had fixed in September, was found hanging loose again in October, as if someone had forced it. Scratches appeared on the back door lock. One morning, Helen found a cigarette butt on the back deck. Neither she nor Walt smoked. Neither did anyone they knew, she told Walt. She wanted to install cameras. He resisted at first, the way Walt resisted anything that required him to learn new technology, which is to say completely and without logic. "We've lived here 31 years without cameras," he said. "We're not turning into those people." "Those people still have their garden hoses where they left them," Helen replied. Walt grumbled. Helen ordered the cameras. She installed them herself, following a YouTube tutorial made by a 12-year-old, which she found both humiliating and deeply efficient. 4 cameras, wireless, cloud-connected, motion-activated with night vision sharp enough to read a license plate from 40 feet. Helen set them up in places that looked like decorative fixtures. The one on the porch was disguised as a birdhouse. The side gate camera sat inside a fake lantern. Nobody would look twice. For 2 weeks, the cameras recorded the usual nothing. Raccoons at 3 in the morning, the postal carrier cutting through the yard. Walt going outside in his bathrobe to check on a noise that turned out to be a fallen branch. Then on October 14th at 2:22 in the morning, the back deck camera captured something that made Helen's blood go cold. A figure. Dark clothing, hood up, moving along the side of the house with a purposeful, familiar stride. Not a stranger fumbling in the dark. Someone who knew exactly where they were going. The figure stopped at the back gate, reached over without hesitation, lifted the latch from the inside, the way you could only do if you knew the latch was broken, and walked into the backyard. They stayed for 11 minutes. The camera caught them examining the back door, the windows, the junction box on the side of the house. Then they left the same way they came, latch reclosed, gate untouched. Like a ghost, Helen watched the footage 7 times before showing Walt. "Could be a burglar," Walt said, but his voice was thin. "A burglar who knows our gate latch," Helen replied. "A burglar who spent 11 minutes looking and didn't take anything." She went back through the cloud storage, found 2 more visits, October 8th, September 29th. Same figure, same route, same 11 to 14-minute window. Never taking anything, just looking, just learning the house. Helen took the footage to the police. An officer named Kendall, young enough to be her grandson, watched 30 seconds of it on his phone and told her it was probably a neighbor's kid looking for a lost cat. He gave her a pamphlet about neighborhood watch programs and a non-emergency number. That night, Helen sat at the kitchen table and opened her notebook. She'd been keeping notes for weeks. Dates, times, license plates she'd jotted down from those late-night cars. The pattern of lights in the Anderson house. The frequency of Mrs. Calloway's curtain watching, which had shifted from casual to obsessive. "Walt," she said, "I think something is very wrong on this street." "I think you're right," he said, which was the first time in their 47-year marriage that Walt agreed with one of Helen's suspicions without putting up a fight first. They started planning. Not a police report, not a neighborhood meeting, something quieter. Here's what Helen Garza understood that the police didn't. If someone was casing her house regularly, methodically, without stealing anything, then they weren't planning a burglary. They were planning something bigger. Something that required knowing every detail of the house, its routines, its vulnerabilities. And if that was happening on a street where unfamiliar cars appeared at strange hours, where a formerly normal house now glowed with the wrong kind of light, and where neighbors deflected questions instead of answering them, then Helen's problem wasn't just her problem, it was the whole street's problem. But she also understood something else. If she and Walt stayed home and started watching too openly, whoever was doing this would notice. Helen had been invisible her whole life. A bookkeeper, a grandmother, an old woman with hydrangeas. Nobody looked twice at her, and she knew it. That invisibility was an asset, but only if she used it right. So she came up with the plan. They would announce a 2-week vacation, loudly, publicly. They would load suitcases, lock the house, wave goodbye, and vanish. The street would believe 26 Meadow Lane was empty. And then Helen and Walt would sit 4 blocks away in a motel room and watch. Not just their house. Through the street-facing camera, they could see the Callaway front, the DeLuca driveway, and the alley next to the Anderson property. If something was happening on Meadow Lane that required the Garzas to be gone, then their absence would be the trigger. The plan was simple. Sit, watch, document. 2 weeks of patience and the street would tell them everything. What Helen didn't plan for, what she couldn't have planned for, was what the cameras would actually show her. The first 24 hours of footage were exactly what you'd expect. Nothing. Meadow Lane sat quiet and unremarkable under the November sky. Mrs. Callaway collected her mail at 11:15, same as always. Frank DeLuca walked his terrier at 7 in the morning and again at 4 in the afternoon. A delivery truck stopped at the Anderson house, dropped a package, and left. Helen watched it all from the motel room, switching between cameras on the laptop, making notes in her book. Walt sat on the other bed, watching a nature documentary with the volume low, occasionally glancing at Helen's screen the way you glance at someone doing a crossword puzzle. Mildly interested, not invested. Day 2, same thing. Cars passed. Sprinklers ran on timers. A cat crossed the Garza front yard and paused to sniff the fake birdhouse camera, its face filling the entire screen for 3 absurd seconds. Thrilling, Walt said. Patience, Helen said. Day 3 brought the first crack at 1:47 in the morning, the street-facing camera activated on motion. Helen's phone buzzed on the nightstand. She'd set alerts for any movement between midnight and 5. She grabbed it, squinted at the small screen, then sat up and opened the laptop. A car. Dark sedan. No visible plates. It pulled up to the curb directly in front of the Anderson house and sat there, engine running, headlights off. For 9 minutes, nothing happened. Then the passenger door opened and a figure got out. Same build, same dark clothing, same hood as the person who'd been visiting the Garza backyard. But they didn't go to the Garza house this time. They walked up the Anderson driveway, past the front door, and around the side of the house where the camera couldn't follow. Walt had given up pretending to sleep. He stood behind Helen, both of them watching the frozen seconds tick by on the timestamp. 4 minutes later, the figure reappeared. This time, they were carrying something. A box, not large, maybe the size of a microwave. They loaded it into the sedan's trunk, got back in, and the car pulled away, smooth. Practiced. Routine. That wasn't a burglar either, Walt said. Helen saved the footage and wrote in her notebook. November 5th, 1:47 a.m. Dark sedan, 1 occupant exits. Enters Anderson property via side access. Exits 4 minutes later carrying small box. Departs southbound. She underlined the word routine, because that's what bothered her most. Not the strangeness of it, the familiarity. This person moved like they'd done this 100 times. Like it was a job. The next night it happened again, same time window, different car. This time a pickup truck with a covered bed, 2 figures, same route to the Anderson house, same side entrance. They stayed longer, almost 20 minutes, and when they emerged, they were carrying 3 boxes. Night 5, a van. Night 6, another sedan. Every night between 1 and 3 in the morning, vehicles arrived at the Anderson house. People went in through the side, and things came out. What's in that house? Walt asked on the morning of day 7, staring at the screen with the expression of a man who'd stopped finding any of this amusing. Helen flipped through her notes. 7 nights, 9 vehicles, at least 14 individuals, though some may have been repeated. An estimated 23 to 30 boxes were removed, ranging from small to medium-sized. I don't know, Helen said. But whatever it is, someone wanted us gone before they ramped it up. Walt looked at her. You think the visits to our house, the gate, the scouting, that was about making sure we weren't watching? Helen didn't answer right away. She pulled up the earliest footage she had of the hooded figure in their backyard and played it side by side with the footage from last night's Anderson house visitor. Same gate. Same way of reaching over the gate. Same slight hitch in the left shoulder when they turned. Same person, I think, Helen said carefully. That whoever is running things out of the Anderson house knows that our back deck has a direct line of sight to their side entrance. And I think they've been coming to our property to figure out whether we could see them and what it would take to make sure we didn't. The implication settled over the room like a weight. Someone on Meadow Lane, possibly someone the Garzas had waved to for decades, was involved in something serious enough to case a 73-year-old couple's home, just to protect the operation's secrecy. Helen closed the laptop and sat back. Her hands, usually so steady, had a fine tremor she couldn't quite control. "We're in over our heads," Walt said quietly. It wasn't a complaint. It was an observation from a man who'd served 2 tours in Vietnam and understood the difference between a challenge and a threat. "Maybe," Helen said. "But we're the only ones watching." She opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote at the top, in her careful bookkeeper's hand, a single question. Who was Keith Anderson? And that right there was the moment Helen Garza stopped being a curious retiree with cameras and started becoming something else entirely. Something nobody on Meadow Lane, not the hooded figures, not the neighbors, not even Walt, fully expected. She became the one person who refused to look away. Keith Anderson was 41 years old, divorced, and on paper, unremarkable. Helen found that out on day 8 from the motel room. Using the second laptop Walt had finally learned to operate after Helen threatened to do everything herself and leave him watching nature documentaries for the remaining 6 days. Public records weren't hard to access if you knew where to look, and Helen knew where to look. 34 years of bookkeeping had taught her that the truth about a person almost never lived in what they said. It lived in what they filed. Tax records, property transfers, business registrations. The paper trail people left behind when they thought nobody was reading. Keith Anderson had inherited the Meadow Lane house from his parents when Pete and Donna moved to Arizona. That much was true. The property transfer was clean, filed in June, notarized and recorded with the county. But the rental story didn't hold up. There was no rental listing. Not on any of the major platforms, not with any local property management company, not even a classified ad in the Penny Saver. Helen checked twice. If Keith was renting that house, he was doing it without advertising, without a lease on file, and without reporting rental income on any document she could find. What she did find was a business registration, KA Logistics LLC. Failed in January of the same year, 8 months before Pete and Donna moved out. Registered to Keith Anderson at a P.O. box in the next county. No website, no employees listed, no visible clients. A logistics company with no logistics. Could be legitimate, Walt offered from across the room, though his tone said he didn't believe it. Could be, Helen agreed, and I could be 25. She dug further. KA Logistics had a commercial vehicle registration. A white cargo van, the kind you see 1,000 times a day and never remember. She cross-referenced the plate number with the footage from Night 5, matched the van that had pulled up to the Anderson house at 1:53 in the morning, the one that 2 figures had loaded with boxes for 20 minutes, was registered to Keith Anderson's own company. He wasn't renting that house to strangers. He was running something out of it himself. Helen wrote it all down, every detail, every connection, every timestamp. Her notebook was filling up fast, the pages covered in her small, precise handwriting, dates and plate numbers and observations organized like the ledgers she'd kept for 3 decades. Numbers told stories if you knew how to listen, and Helen had been listening her whole life. But the numbers only told her what was happening. They didn't tell her why. That answer came on Night 9. And it didn't come from the Anderson house. It came from the Callaways. Helen had set the cameras to record continuously, not just on motion activation. After she realized the motion alerts were missing slow-moving activity at the edges of the frame, it meant more footage to review, hours of empty street and still houses. But it also meant she caught things the alerts would have missed. At 12:17 on Night 9, a light came on in the Callaway garage, not the house, the detached garage behind it, the one Mrs. Callaway claimed they used for storage. The light was dim, muted, like someone had draped a cloth over it. But the street-facing camera caught the faint glow leaking under the garage door, and it caught something else. Mrs. Callaway walked from the house to the garage at 12:17 in the morning. Dolores Callaway was 68 years old, a retired school librarian who went to bed at 9:30 every night and complained about noise past 8. Helen had known her for 26 years. They weren't close, not really. Dolores was the kind of neighbor who brought casseroles when someone died and remembered every birthday but never stayed for dinner. Friendly on the surface, nothing underneath. And here she was, crossing her backyard in the middle of the night, moving with a quickness Helen had never seen from her, glancing left and right before slipping into the garage and pulling the door shut behind her. 14 minutes later, a car arrived. Not one of the sedans or trucks that visited the Anderson house. A silver Honda, older model, with a dented rear fender. It parked on the street 1 house down from the Callaways. A woman got out, maybe 40, carrying a duffel bag. She didn't go to the front door. She walked around to the back and entered through the same garage. She stayed for 22 minutes. When she left, the duffel bag looked lighter. Helen. Walt's voice was flat. He'd been watching over her shoulder, his hand resting on the back of her chair, and she could feel the tension in his grip. "That's 2 houses." Helen nodded slowly. 2 houses on their street involved in whatever this was. The Anderson property with its nightly box removals. The Callaway garage with its midnight visitors and duffel bags. 2 operations running in parallel within 200 feet of each other, and between them, sitting exactly in the middle, was 26 Meadow Lane, the Garza house, the one with the back deck that overlooked the Anderson side entrance. The one with the side windows that faced the Callaway garage. The one that had been methodically scouted by a hooded figure who knew the gate latch, the lock, the layout. The Garzas weren't just inconvenient witnesses, they were the blind spot, the single property whose sightlines covered both operations. And someone had been working very hard to make sure those sightlines stayed dark. "We need to go to the police," Walt said. "We went to the police," Helen reminded him. "Officer Kendall told me my burglar was looking for a cat. That was before. We have more now. Plates footage, patterns. We have footage of cars parking and people walking. We have boxes that could contain anything. We have a woman with a duffel bag visiting a garage. Walt, we don't even know what the crime is yet." He sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his knee the way he did when the weather was about to turn. "Does it matter? Something's wrong. We both know it. It matters because if we go in with suspicion and grainy video, they'll give us another pamphlet. I'm not interested in pamphlets." Helen took off her glasses and pressed her fingers against her eyes. "I want to know what's in those boxes. I want to know what's in that duffel bag. I want to know why Dolores Callaway is awake at midnight doing something she doesn't want anyone to see." Walt was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You want to go back?" It wasn't a question. Helen looked at him. "Not to the house. Not while they think we're gone. But there's a way to get a better angle on the Callaway garage without anyone knowing." She pulled up a satellite view of Meadow Lane on the laptop and pointed. The alley between the DeLuca and Anderson properties ran behind the houses, connecting to a service road that the city used for garbage trucks and utility access. From the right spot in that alley, you could see directly into the Callaway backyard, the garage, the door, everything. "I can place a camera there," Helen said. "Small one, battery-powered. Stick it to the fence post near the Anderson property line. Nobody walks that alley at night." Nobody would look. "Nobody except the people who are already using it," Walt said. Helen paused. He was right. The alley was likely part of the route. The hooded figure, the late-night visitors, had to be accessing the Anderson side entrance from somewhere, and the alley was the most logical path. "Then we place it during the day," Helen said. "Tomorrow morning. I go alone. 10 minutes. In and out. I'm an old woman checking on her hydrangeas because she forgot to set the sprinkler timer before vacation. Nobody questions that. Nobody questions it because it's insane. Nobody questions it because I'm invisible," Helen corrected. "That's the whole point, Walt." He stared at her. Then he shook his head, not in refusal, but in the particular resigned admiration of a man who'd been married to this woman for nearly 5 decades and had never once won an argument when she used that voice. "I'm driving you," he said. "And I'm waiting in the car. Fine. And you're taking the phone with the emergency button. Fine. And if anything looks even slightly wrong, you walk away. Walt, promise me." She reached across the space between the beds and took his hand. His fingers were thick and rough, knuckles swollen from years of factory work and deck building, but his grip was still steady. "Still sure, I promise," she said. "Before we continue, I want to ask you something. What would you do in Helen's position? You've seen enough to know something is wrong. The police won't help. Your neighbors might be involved, and the only advantage you have is that everyone thinks you're a harmless old woman on vacation. Would you keep watching? Would you walk away? Let me know in the comments." The next morning, Helen drove the Taurus back to Meadow Lane, while Walt waited at the corner of Birch and Elm, engine idling, eyes on the mirrors. She dressed carefully, gardening gloves, a floppy sun hat despite the November chill, and a watering can she'd bought at the dollar store. The camera was in her jacket pocket. Battery-powered, the size of a deck of cards, with an adhesive mount and 72 hours of recording time. She parked on the street behind Meadow Lane, walked through the service road entrance, and entered the alley. It was narrower than she remembered. Chain-link fences on both sides, overgrown with dead vines and cluttered with things people stored behind their houses because they didn't want them seen from the front. An old barbecue grill, stacked plastic bins, a broken children's swing set that nobody had used in years. Helen walked slowly, watering can in hand, looking for all the world like a grandmother who'd wandered into the wrong alley. Her eyes moved fast. The Anderson fence was wooden, 6 feet tall, with a gate that showed fresh scratches around the handle. Through the slats, she could see the side entrance to the house. The door was closed, but a muddy path had been worn into the grass leading from the alley gate to the door. Not a path from occasional use, a path from nightly traffic. She kept walking until she reached the fence post where the Anderson and DeLuca properties met. Here, the angle opened up. She could see past the Anderson yard, across the narrow gap between houses, and directly into the Callaway backyard. The garage sat square in her line of sight, its rear window visible, its side door facing the alley. Helen peeled the adhesive backing off the camera mount, pressed it firmly against the fence post at a height that would be obscured by the dead vine growing across the top rail, and angled the lens toward the Callaway garage. She pressed the power button. A tiny green light blinked once, then went dark. 72 hours. That's what the camera would give her. 3 nights of footage from an angle the other cameras couldn't reach. She was back in the car in 8 minutes. Well? Walt asked. Done, Helen said. She pulled off the gardening gloves and noticed her hands were trembling again. Not from the cold, not from age. From the knowledge that she'd just placed a surveillance camera in an alley being used by people who did not want to be seen. Take me back to the motel, she said. I need to look at last night's footage. They drove in silence. Walt didn't ask anything else, and Helen was grateful. She needed to think, because something had been bothering her since she'd walked that alley, something she'd noticed without fully registering. The muddy path from the alley gate to the Anderson side door, it didn't just go to the Anderson house. There was a second track, fainter but visible, branching off the main path and cutting through a gap in the fence toward the DeLuca property. 3 houses, not 2. Helen didn't say it out loud yet. She needed to be sure. But sitting in the passenger seat, watching the tire shop and sandwich place come back into view, she felt something shift inside her. A kind of cold clarity that settled into her bones and wouldn't leave. For 31 years, she'd lived on a street that she thought she knew. She'd waved at these people, she'd accepted their casseroles and returned their Tupperware and made small talk about weather and grandchildren. She'd trusted the surface of things because the surface had always been enough. Now the surface was peeling back, and what lay underneath was something Helen Garza had never imagined. Back at the motel, she reviewed the previous night's footage from all 4 cameras. The Anderson house had received its usual late-night visitor, a dark SUV this time, 2 individuals, 4 boxes removed. The Callaway garage showed activity at 12:41, earlier than the night before. Same pattern, light on. Dolores crossed to the garage. A visitor, a different car this time, arriving 12 minutes later. Duffel bag in, duffel bag out, lighter. But now Helen was watching for something new. She pulled up the Garza side gate camera, the one that covered the narrow space between their house and the DeLuca property next door. Most nights, this camera caught nothing but shadows and the occasional possum. Helen had almost stopped reviewing its footage entirely. She went back through the previous 3 nights, scrubbing slowly through the dark hours. Night 7. Nothing. Night 8. Nothing. Night 9. There at 2:14 in the morning. Movement in the DeLuca yard, not along the fence line or near the gate. Deeper in the property, near the back corner of the DeLuca house, where a basement window sat at ground level. A figure crouched beside that window. Not the hooded person she'd come to recognize. Someone smaller, quicker. They lifted the window, which swung open easily, clearly unlocked from inside, and handed something down to someone below. Then they closed the window and disappeared back toward the alley. The whole thing took 90 seconds. Helen played it again and again and a 4th time. The DeLuca house had a basement that Frank DeLuca claimed he'd converted into a home gym 3 years ago. He'd mentioned it at a block party. Nobody had ever been invited to see it. 3 houses. 3 separate operations, all running within 200 feet of each other, all using the same alley, all active in the same narrow window of the night. And sitting at the center of it all, dark and empty, was 26 Meadow Lane, the Garza house, the property that connected the sight lines. The one place where a person sitting on a back deck or looking out a side window might, on any given night, see all 3. Helen understood now why someone had been casing their home. It wasn't preparation for a burglary, it was a risk assessment. Someone had been figuring out exactly what the Garzas could see, whether the old couple was a threat, and how to neutralize that threat if needed. The vacation ruse, the empty suitcases, the loud goodbye. It worked. The street believed the Garzas were gone, and in their absence the operations had intensified. More vehicles, more boxes, more visitors. As if a dam had broken, as if the one thing holding it all back had been a 73-year-old man with a bad knee and a 71-year-old woman with hydrangeas. Helen closed the laptop and sat very still. "How bad?" Walt asked from the other bed. "Frank's involved too." Walt didn't respond right away. Frank DeLuca, the man they'd known for 26 years. The man who'd helped Walt re-roof the garage in 2009. The man who brought over tomatoes from his garden every August and always asked about the girls. "You're sure?" Helen turned the laptop to face him and played the basement window footage. Walt watched it twice. Then he stood up, walked to the bathroom, ran cold water over his face and came back. His eyes were red and Helen couldn't tell if it was from the water or something else. "So what's the play?" he asked. His voice had changed. The reluctant husband humoring his wife's suspicion was gone. In his place was something older, something that remembered how to assess a situation and act. The soldier who'd never quite left. 3 more days of footage, Helen said. "The alley camera will give us the Callaway garage angle. I review everything, connect the timelines, build a complete picture. Vehicles, individuals, frequency, patterns. When we have enough to show this isn't suspicion but documentation, we go to the police, not Officer Kendall, someone higher. And if something happens before then..." Helen looked at him like, "What?" "Like someone figures out the cameras. Like someone comes to our house and finds the equipment. Like one of these people decides the old couple on vacation is a loose end." The motel room felt smaller suddenly. The hum of the highway outside, the rattle of the heater unit under the window, the distant clang of the tire shop next door, all of it pressing in. "Then we deal with it," Helen said, "the way we've dealt with everything else. Together." Walt held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once and sat down beside her. "Show me how to work the timestamps," he said. "If we're doing this, I'm not just the driver." They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, side by side on the motel bed, 2 laptops open, splitting the footage review between them. Walt, once he understood the system, proved surprisingly methodical. His factory experience had given him an eye for repetition, for the rhythm of a process. He started spotting vehicle patterns Helen had missed, noting that certain cars always arrived within minutes of each other, suggesting coordination. By 10 that night, they had a wall. Not a physical wall, the motel room didn't allow for that, but a digital one. Helen had created a spreadsheet, dates across the top, houses down the side, Anderson, Callaway, DeLuca. Each cell is filled with timestamps, vehicle descriptions, and activity notes, color-coded, cross-referenced, as clean and precise as any ledger she'd ever kept. The pattern was undeniable. 3 separate operations running on a coordinated schedule, staggered to avoid overlap, using the same alley for access, and all escalating in frequency since the Garza's departure. Walt leaned back and rubbed his eyes. "We've got enough," almost, Helen said. "One more night from the alley camera. If it confirms the Callaway garage interior activity, we have a complete picture. 3 houses, 3 points of evidence, 3 chances for the police to match this to something in their system, and then we come home from vacation." That night, Helen couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, listening to Walt's breathing, steady and deep, the breathing of a man who could sleep through anything because he'd trained himself to during the war. The motel ceiling had a crack that ran from the light fixture to the corner, and Helen traced it with her eyes, thinking, 31 years on Meadow Lane. She thought about the day they'd moved in, Walt carrying boxes while their older daughter, Maria, then 6, ran circles around the empty living room. She thought about the neighborhood cookouts, the Christmases with lights on every house, the way the whole street came out for the 4th of July, and Walt set off fireworks in the cul-de-sac while Frank DeLuca complained about the noise and then lit his own. She thought about Dolores Callaway bringing a pie when Helen's mother died, about Pete Anderson lending his truck when they moved Maria into her college dorm, about the years of ordinary kindness that made a street into a community, and she thought about how all of it, every wave and every casserole and every borrowed tool, had existed on top of something she'd never seen, not because it wasn't there. Because she hadn't looked at 2:11 in the morning. Helen's phone buzzed, motion alert. She picked it up, expecting the usual. A car, a figure, boxes. Instead, the screen showed something that made her sit up so fast she knocked the phone off the bed and had to scramble for it in the dark. The front porch camera, her house. 26 Meadow Lane. The image was grainy in the night vision green, but clear enough. A figure on the porch. Not the hooded scout. Someone new. Bigger, moving differently, less careful. They were pouring something on the front door. Helen's hands went numb. She watched as the figure stepped back, reached into a pocket, and produced a small, bright flicker. "A lighter, Walt," she said. Her voice didn't sound like her own. "Walt, wake up." He was beside her in seconds, reading her tone before he read the screen. They watched together as the figure held the flame to the base of the door. The liquid caught immediately, a bright orange bloom that the night vision camera rendered in terrifying shades of white. Their house was on fire. Walt grabbed the car keys. Helen grabbed both laptops and the notebook. They were out the door in 45 seconds, but Helen knew, even as she ran across the motel parking lot in her slippers, that by the time they reached Meadow Lane, it wouldn't matter. The fire wasn't an accident. It wasn't random. It was a message, and the message was clear. Someone on Meadow Lane knew the Garzas were watching, and they wanted to make sure there was nothing left to watch from. They smelled it before they saw it. 3 blocks from Meadow Lane. The air changed, that acrid, chemical bite that gets into the back of your throat and stays there. Walt drove faster than he should have, running the stop sign at Elm and cutting through the church parking lot, and Helen didn't say a word about it, because she was watching the sky ahead, where an orange glow pulsed against the low clouds like a sick heartbeat. When they turned onto Meadow Lane, the scene hit them both at once. 2 fire trucks. An ambulance with its lights spinning but its siren off. Neighbors in bathrobes and coats standing on the opposite sidewalk in that stunned, loose-limbed way people stand when they've been woken by something terrible. And 26 Meadow Lane. The house Walt had carried his daughter into 31 years ago. The house Helen had planted hydrangeas in front of every spring since 1993, was burning, not fully engulfed. The fire department had arrived fast, probably called by one of the neighbors. The front porch was gone, collapsed into a blackened tangle of wood and melted siding. The front door, the one the figure had doused, was a rectangle of flame. Smoke poured from the first-floor windows in thick, rolling waves, and the firefighters were hitting it with 2 hose lines, water arcing into the destruction with a sound like tearing fabric. Helen didn't get out of the car. She sat in the passenger seat with both laptops in her arms and her notebook pressed against her chest, and she watched her house burn. Walt had stopped the tourists in the middle of the street because there was nowhere else to go, and he sat behind the wheel with his hands still gripping it, knuckles white, jaw working like he was chewing on words that wouldn't come out. "The hydrangeas?" Helen said. Her voice was very quiet, very steady. "The wrong kind of steady?" Walt reached over and put his hand on her arm. Not her hand. Her arm holding on. A firefighter approached the car, waving them back. "Sir, you can't park here. We need this lane clear." "That's our house," Walt said. The firefighter's expression changed. The professional command softened into something more careful. "Sir, can you move the vehicle to the end of the block? Someone will come talk to you." Walt moved the car. Helen still didn't get out. From their new position at the end of the cul-de-sac, they could see the whole street. The Anderson house, dark and still. The Calloway house, where Dolores stood on her lawn in a quilted robe, arms crossed watching the fire with an expression Helen couldn't read from this distance. The DeLuca house, where Frank's front light was on, but Frank himself was nowhere in sight. And between them all, the Garza house dying in the November night. A fire investigator named Reyes found them 20 minutes later. Short woman, late 30s, with tired eyes and a clipboard that had seen a lot of bad nights. She asked the standard questions. "When did you leave? When did you last check the house? Any electrical issues? Any recent work done on the property?" Walt answered with the cover story. Sarasota, 2 weeks, left Saturday. Everything was fine when they left. No electrical problems, no construction, nothing out of the ordinary. Helen said nothing. She held the laptops and the notebook and let Walt talk because she was doing math in her head. Calculating. The fire had been set at approximately 2:14 in the morning. The fire department was already here when they arrived at 2:31. That meant someone had called it in within minutes. "Who reported it?" Helen asked, interrupting Walt mid-sentence. Reyes checked her notes. Anonymous call from a cell phone came in at 2:17. 3 minutes. The fire was set at 2:14. Someone called it in at 2:17. That wasn't a neighbor waking up, smelling smoke and fumbling for a phone. That was someone who was already awake, already watching, and already knew the fire was coming. Helen filed that away and said nothing else. By 4 in the morning, the fire was out. The damage was concentrated in the front of the house. The porch was destroyed. The living room was gutted. Smoke and water damage extended through most of the first floor. But the back of the house, the kitchen, the bedrooms upstairs, the back deck with its view of the Anderson side entrance, those had survived. The cameras had survived too. Helen's birdhouse on the porch was gone, melted into the wreckage. But the side gate camera, the backyard camera, and the street-facing camera mounted under the eave of the garage, all of them were intact. More importantly, the footage was in the cloud, every second of every night, backed up automatically to a server that no amount of fire could touch. Reyes told them the house would need a structural inspection before anyone could enter. She gave them a card, insurance information, emergency housing resources, victim services. The standard packet for people who'd just lost a piece of their lives. "We'll be at the Comfort Lodge on Birch Street," Helen said, room 112. Reyes wrote it down without comment. They drove back to the motel in silence. The sun was starting to come up, thin and gray through the November clouds, and the tire shop next door was still dark. Helen carried the laptops inside, set them on the bed, and opened the one connected to the cameras. She pulled up the front porch footage first, the one from the destroyed birdhouse camera. The recording was intact up to the moment the fire reached the camera's housing. 2 minutes and 14 seconds of footage showing exactly what Helen had seen on her phone. The figure approaching, the liquid being poured, the lighter, the flame catching, and then, in the seconds before the camera died, something Helen hadn't noticed on the small phone screen. The figure turned, just slightly. Enough for the night vision to catch the left side of their face. Helen paused the frame. Walt leaned in. The image was grainy, green-tinted, distorted by the heat that was already warping the air between the camera and the door. But the jawline was visible, the shape of the ear, a patch of lighter skin on the neck that could have been a scar or a birthmark. Helen didn't recognize the face, but she saved the frame, enhanced it as much as the software allowed, and placed it alongside every other image she'd captured over the past 11 days. Then she opened the street-facing camera's footage from the same timestamp. This camera had a wider angle and sat higher up under the garage eave. It had captured the figure's arrival. They'd come on foot, not by car, walking from the direction of the alley between the DeLuca and Anderson properties. The same alley Helen had placed her 5th camera in 2 days ago. The figure walked with purpose, no hesitation. They crossed the Garza front yard, went straight to the porch, did what they came to do, and left the same way they'd arrived. Total time on the property, less than 2 minutes. But here was what made Helen's breath catch. As the figure retreated toward the alley, the street camera caught movement at the far edge of the frame. A second person, standing at the mouth of the alley, partially hidden by the fence. Not moving, not helping, just watching. A lookout, and this person wasn't wearing a hood. The camera caught their face in full. Helen recognized her immediately, Dolores Calloway, the woman who'd brought a pie when Helen's mother died. The woman who remembered every birthday on the street, the retired school librarian who went to bed at 9:30 and complained about noise, standing in an alley at 2 in the morning watching Helen's house burn. Helen stared at the screen for a long time, long enough that Walt stopped looking at the image and started looking at her. "Helen, I see it," she said. "What do you want to do?" She closed the laptop, slowly, deliberately, the way she used to close a ledger at the end of a fiscal year when all the numbers balanced and there was nothing left to reconcile. "I want to finish what we started," she said, "and then I want to burn their world down the way they burned ours. Except I'm going to use paperwork instead of a lighter." Walt almost smiled. It was a grim thing, more teeth than humor, but it was there. They spent the rest of that day building the case. Not for the police, not yet. Helen had learned her lesson with Officer Kendall and his pamphlet. She wasn't going back to someone who could dismiss her. She was going to someone who couldn't. Helen had a niece, Claudia Reyes Torres. No relation to the fire investigator, though the shared surname was a coincidence that Helen found darkly amusing. Claudia was an assistant district attorney in the county prosecutor's office. She handled white-collar crime, fraud, money laundering. The kind of cases that lived in spreadsheets and paper trails. The kind of cases Helen understood in her bones. Helen hadn't spoken to Claudia in almost a year. Family was complicated. After the girls grew up and moved away, Helen's extended family had thinned out the way families do when distance and time do their quiet work. But Claudia had always respected Helen. Had once told her at a Thanksgiving dinner years ago that Helen had the mind of an investigator trapped in the body of a bookkeeper. Helen found Claudia's number in her phone and stared at it for a while. Then she dialed. Claudia picked up on the third ring. "Aunt Helen? Is everything okay?" No, Helen said. But it will be. I need your help. She told Claudia everything. Not the emotional version, not the version where she was a frightened old woman whose house had been burned. The professional version, dates, times, plate numbers, business registrations, property records. Camera footage stored in the cloud with timestamps that couldn't be altered. She talked for 47 minutes. Claudia didn't interrupt once. When Helen finished, the line was quiet for several seconds. "Aunt Helen," Claudia said, "you've built a better preliminary case file than half the investigators in my office. I was a bookkeeper for 34 years. Numbers don't lie if you read them right. How soon can you send me the footage? I can share the cloud access in 5 minutes. Do it, and Aunt Helen, don't go back to that street. Don't talk to any of those neighbors. Don't do anything until you hear from me." How long? "Give me 48 hours. Helen hung up and shared the cloud link. Then she sat back in the motel chair and let herself feel, just for a moment, the weight of what had happened. Her house, her hydrangeas, the deck Walt built. Maria's height marks on the kitchen door frame. 31 years of living, some of it now smoke and ash and water damage. She'd told Walt she wanted to burn their world down with paperwork. And she meant it. But underneath the determination, underneath the bookkeeper's precision and the soldier's wife's steel, there was grief. Simple, ordinary grief for a home that had been violated by people she'd trusted. Walt sat beside her and said nothing. He just put his arm around her shoulders and let her lean into him. They stayed like that for a long time. Two old people in a motel room that smelled like bleach, holding each other while the world outside continued to not care. The 48 hours passed slowly. Helen reviewed every piece of footage she had, organizing it chronologically, annotating each clip with the kind of detail that would make a prosecutor's job easy. She created timelines for each house: Anderson, Callaway, DeLuca. 3 parallel tracks of activity that, when laid side by side, revealed a coordinated operation running like clockwork. The alley camera, the one she'd placed on the fence post, was still recording. Its 72-hour battery would die sometime that evening, but the footage it had already captured was in the cloud. Helen reviewed it and found exactly what she'd hoped for: the Callaway garage from behind. The camera had caught the rear window, which was covered from the inside with dark paper, but not completely. A gap at the bottom edge let a sliver of light escape, and through that sliver the camera had captured shadows, shapes moving inside. The outlines of what looked like equipment, angular, boxy, not the kind of things you'd store in a residential garage. More importantly, the camera had caught traffic. Over 2 nights. 9 individuals accessed the Callaway garage through the back door, always from the alley, always between midnight and 3. 4 of them also appeared in footage from the Anderson house. 2 appeared in the DeLuca basement window clip. Overlap, shared personnel moving between all 3 houses, a single network operating out of multiple locations on the same residential street. Walt, who'd been reviewing the DeLuca footage, called Helen over. "Look at this." He'd found something she'd missed. On night 10, after the usual basement window exchange, the person who'd handed items down had lingered in the DeLuca yard. Instead of retreating immediately to the alley, they'd stood by the fence and made a phone call. The camera was too far away to capture audio, but it captured the phone's screen glow illuminating the person's face. Frank DeLuca's nephew, Tommy DeLuca, 28 years old. Helen had met him exactly twice, both times at Frank's 4th of July barbecues. Quiet kid, nervous energy, the kind of person who smiled too wide and laughed too late. "Frank's family is in this," Walt said. "Frank's in this," Helen corrected. "You don't run an operation out of someone's basement without the homeowner knowing." "The window opens from the inside, Walt. Someone inside that house unlocked it." Walt sat back. His face had the weathered stillness of a man processing something he didn't want to accept. Frank DeLuca, who'd helped him carry shingles up a ladder. Frank DeLuca, who'd given Maria her first summer job watering his garden when she was 12. "I keep thinking about the tomatoes," Walt said quietly. "Every August, never missed a year." Helen put her hand on his. "I know," on the evening of day 12, Claudia called. "Aunt Helen, I need you to listen carefully." Helen sat down. Walt moved closer. "I took your footage and documentation to the County Organized Crime Task Force. They've been investigating a distribution network operating out of residential properties in 3 different neighborhoods, fencing stolen goods, primarily electronics, and pharmaceuticals. They had 2 of the 3 networks identified but couldn't locate the 3rd hub." Claudia paused. "Your street is the 3rd hub." Helen's hand tightened around the phone. "The task force has been trying to map the Meadow Lane operation for 4 months. They knew it existed based on intercepted communications, but they couldn't get eyes on it." The houses involved are in a cul-de-sac with limited access points, and the people running it were careful about external surveillance. They were careful about internal surveillance too, Helen said. They were watching us, scouting our property. That's consistent with what the task force found. The operation's security protocol included monitoring neighbor routines. Your house was flagged as the primary observation risk because of its sightlines. Helen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the motel's inadequate heating. The arson, she said, the task force believes it was ordered by whoever coordinates between the three houses. Your vacation created an opportunity to escalate operations, but the cameras, if anyone spotted them, would have triggered a containment response. Burning down our house is a containment response? In their world, yes. Destroy the observation point, eliminate the evidence, create enough chaos that even if you suspected something, you'd be too busy dealing with insurance and rebuilding to pursue it. Helen looked at Walt. His jaw was set. The soldier was back. What happens now? Helen asked. The task force is moving. They want to execute simultaneous warrants on all three properties within the next 72 hours. They'll coordinate with the fire marshal's office on the arson investigation. Aunt Helen, your footage isn't just helpful. It's the backbone of the case. Timestamps, vehicle identifications, personnel overlap between locations. You built them a prosecution map. I built them a ledger, Helen said. That's all I've ever known how to do. One more thing, Claudia said. They need you to stay away from Meadow Lane until the warrants are served. No contact with any neighbor. No retrieval of the alley camera. Nothing that could tip off the operation. What about our house? The structural inspection cleared it for limited access, but the task force is asking you to wait. If anyone on the street sees you returning before the warrants, it could compromise the timeline. Helen agreed. She hung up and relayed everything to Walt, who listened without interrupting, the same way he'd listened to briefings decades ago. When she finished, he nodded once. 72 hours. 72 hours. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the parking lot, the tire shop, the sandwich place. The ordinary world going about its business. You know what gets me? He said. It's not the fire, it's not the crime. It's that they did it all behind smiles. Dolores and her pies. Frank and his tomatoes. They sat at our table and shook our hands, and all along they were running this thing right under our noses. They counted on us not looking, Helen said. They counted wrong. He turned from the window. When this is over, when the warrants are served and the arrests are made and we can go home, what do we do? Helen thought about it. Really thought the way she thought about columns that didn't balance, about numbers that whispered when you gave them enough silence. We replant the hydrangeas, she said. Walt looked at her. Then he laughed. A real laugh. The first one she'd heard from him since this whole thing started. It wasn't loud, wasn't long, but it was genuine, and it filled the motel room in a way that the bleach smell and the highway noise never could. Hydrangeas, he repeated. They burned the porch, not the garden beds. The roots are still there, Walt. They'll come back in the spring. He crossed the room and kissed the top of her head. 31 years, he said, and you're still the toughest person I know. Don't forget it, she said. That night, Helen couldn't sleep again. But this time, it wasn't fear keeping her awake. It was anticipation. 72 hours. 3 more days in this motel room, watching footage she'd already memorized, waiting for the machinery of justice to do what it did. Slowly, methodically, like a ledger being audited line by line. She lay in the dark and thought about Dolores Calloway standing in that alley, watching the fire. No horror on her face. No surprise. Just observation. The same way she watched the street from her window every day, cataloging comings and goings, noting who was home and who wasn't. Helen had always thought Dolores was nosy. Turns out she was something worse. She was the lookout, had been, probably, for a long time. The eyes of the operation, hidden behind the perfect disguise of a retired librarian who had nothing better to do than watch the street, and she'd been watching Helen too. All those years of curtain twitching. All those casual questions about travel plans and evening routines. Not nosiness, intelligence gathering. Dolores had been mapping the Garza's patterns the same way Helen had been mapping the operation's 2 women on the same street, watching each other, each believing the other was harmless. The difference was that Helen had been right about being underestimated, and Dolores had been wrong. Helen smiled in the dark. Not a happy smile. A satisfied one. The smile of a bookkeeper who'd found the discrepancy everyone else had missed and followed it all the way to the bottom of the page. 3 days. And then Meadow Lane would learn what happened when you underestimated a 71-year-old woman with a notebook, a cloud account, and 47 years of practice at making the numbers tell the truth. The warrants came on a Tuesday. Helen knew because Claudia called at 6 in the morning, which was unlike her. Claudia was a 9 o'clock caller. Professional hours, professional habits. A 6 a.m. call meant something was either very wrong or very imminent. "It's today," Claudia said, simultaneous execution across all 3 properties. 7 a.m. "I wanted you to hear it from me first." Helen sat up in bed. Walt was already awake beside her, reading her expression the way he'd read it for 47 years. "Will they be safe?" Helen asked. "Meaning the officers? Meaning the street? Meaning anyone who happened to be walking a dog at the wrong moment on a Tuesday morning? Task Force has been planning this for weeks. Your documentation gave them entry and exit routes, personnel patterns, peak and off-peak windows. They're going in during the lowest activity period you identified." Helen had noted in her ledger that between 6 and 8 in the morning, all 3 houses went completely quiet. No arrivals, no departures. The operation slept during those hours, trusting that normal neighborhood activity would mask the transition. It was the one window where everyone involved would be stationary, findable, and unprepared. "Aunt Helen," Claudia said, "stay at the motel. Do not drive to Meadow Lane. You'll know when it's done." Helen hung up and told Walt. He got dressed. Not because there was anywhere to go, but because Walter Garza was not the kind of man who received news of consequence in his pajamas. He put on a clean shirt, buttoned it to the collar, and sat on the edge of the bed with his hands on his knees. 7 o'clock, he said. Helen looked at the clock on the nightstand. 6:23, 37 minutes. She opened the laptop out of habit, pulling up the camera feeds. The street-facing camera showed Meadow Lane in the pale gray of early morning. Nothing moved. The Anderson house sat dark behind its curtains. The Calloway house showed one light in the kitchen, Dolores's early morning routine, tea and the newspaper, same as every day for 26 years. The DeLuca house was still 26 Meadow Lane. Their house sat wounded and quiet, the blackened porch, the boarded front windows. The scorch marks climbing the siding like dark fingers reaching for the second floor. But the structure stood. The garage was untouched. The backyard with its deck and its view of the Anderson side entrance was intact. Helen watched the screen and waited. At 6:51, the first unmarked vehicles appeared at the far end of Meadow Lane. Helen counted them. 4 SUVs, dark-colored, moving in formation at a speed that was too slow for passing through and too purposeful for lost drivers. Behind them, 2 marked police cruisers with their lights off. They split with precision. 2 SUVs and a cruiser peeled toward the Anderson house. 1 SUV continued to the Calloway property. The remaining SUV and cruiser stopped at the DeLuca house. Helen's hand found Walt's at 6:58. Officers exited the vehicles. Body armor, tactical gear, warrants in hand. They moved to the doors of all 3 houses simultaneously, and Helen realized she was holding her breath. 7 o'clock. The knocking was loud enough to pick up on the camera's microphone, even from across the street. 3 sets of fists on 3 sets of doors, the universal sound of authority arriving without invitation. The Anderson house opened first, not Keith Anderson. A man Helen didn't recognize, heavyset, wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants, the rumpled look of someone dragged from sleep. Officers moved past him before he'd finished processing what was happening. The DeLuca house opened second. Frank himself. Helen watched him appear in the doorway in his bathrobe, the same navy terrycloth robe he'd worn to retrieve his newspaper every morning for as long as she could remember. He stood very still as an officer presented the warrant. Then his shoulders dropped, just slightly, the way a bridge drops before it collapses, and he stepped aside. The Calloway house didn't open. Helen watched the officers knock again, harder, announce themselves. Knock a third time. She could see the kitchen lights still on through the front window. Dolores was in there. Had to be. 40 seconds passed. Then the door opened, and Dolores Calloway stepped onto her porch, wearing her quilted robe, her reading glasses pushed up into her hair, holding her teacup like she'd simply been interrupted mid-sentence. Even through the grainy camera feed, Helen could read her expression. Calm, controlled. The face of a woman who had prepared for this possibility and filed it away under acceptable losses. Dolores set the teacup on the porch railing, folded her hands, and waited while officers entered her home. "She's not surprised," Walt said. "No," Helen agreed. "She's not." They watched for the next 2 hours as Meadow Lane transformed from a quiet cul-de-sac into a crime scene. Evidence teams arrived. The alley was taped off. Officers carried boxes out of the Anderson house, dozens of them, stacking them in a van that had backed into the driveway. From the Callaway garage, they removed equipment Helen couldn't identify from the camera angle, bulky items on dollies covered in tarps. From the DeLuca basement, access through the front door this time rather than the window, they brought up clear plastic bins. Helen counted 19 of them. Neighbors emerged. Not suspects, just residents of the surrounding streets who'd heard the commotion or seen the lights. They stood in clusters on the sidewalk, phones out, faces stamped with the particular bewilderment of people who'd thought they understood where they lived. At 9:15, 3 individuals were escorted to separate patrol cars. Helen recognized 2 of them. Keith Anderson, hands behind his back, head down, walking with the deflated gait of a man whose logistics company had just been audited in the most literal way possible. And Tommy DeLuca, Frank's nephew, who was talking rapidly to the officer beside him, gesturing with his cuffed hands in the universal language of someone trying to explain their way out of the unexplainable. Frank DeLuca was not among those escorted out. Helen watched for him, scanning every frame, but he didn't appear again after opening the door. Dolores Callaway walked out of her house at 9:47. Not in handcuffs, not escorted. She walked to the same spot on her lawn where she'd stood watching the Garza house burn 12 days earlier. And she stood there again, arms crossed, watching the officers process her garage with the same measured calm. "Why isn't she being arrested?" Walt asked. And there was an edge in his voice Helen rarely heard. "I don't know," Helen said, "yet." Claudia called at noon. "It's done. 3 properties secured, 14 individuals identified so far, 9 in custody." The operation was a fencing and redistribution network for stolen electronics and prescription medications. Goods came in through the Anderson property, were repackaged or altered in the Callaway garage, and stored in the DeLuca basement before being moved to buyers through the alley access route. 14 people, Helen repeated. On our street. Not all residents. Most were couriers and handlers who accessed the properties during overnight hours. The task force estimates the network moved over $2 million in stolen goods through Meadow Lane in the past 18 months. Helen absorbed that number, $2 million. Flowing through houses she'd walked past every day, driven past every evening, lived beside for 3 decades. "What about Dolores Callaway?" Helen asked. A pause. "She's cooperating, voluntarily providing information about the network's structure in exchange for consideration." "Cooperating," Helen said flatly. "I know how that sounds. But her information is filling gaps the task force couldn't close on their own. She's identifying the coordination layer, the people above the street-level operators." "She watched our house burn, Claudia." "I know," Claudia's voice was careful. "And the arson investigation is separate from the task force operation. The fire marshal's office is pursuing that independently. Your camera footage of the individual who set the fire and of Mrs. Callaway's presence in the alley during the act is part of that investigation. Will she be charged? I can't make that determination. But Aunt Helen, your footage places her at the scene of an arson while it was being committed. That's not something cooperation on a separate case makes disappear." Helen let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "Can we go home?" she asked. "The task force has cleared your property. But the front of the house is still an active fire investigation scene, so access is through the back until the marshal signs off. Probably another week." "We'll use the back door," Helen said. "We've been doing everything the back way for 2 weeks. Might as well keep the streak going." Claudia laughed. It was tired. The laugh of someone who'd been working since before dawn on a case built by her 71-year-old aunt. But it was real. "I'll call you when there are updates," Claudia said. "And Aunt Helen? The task force commander asked me to tell you something." "What?" "He said he's been in law enforcement for 22 years and your documentation was the most thorough civilian evidence package he's ever received. His exact words were, 'Whoever this woman is, she should have been an analyst.' Tell him I was," Helen said. "I just analyzed plumbing supplies instead of crime." They drove back to Meadow Lane that afternoon. Walt took the long way, which Helen suspected was not about traffic, but about giving them both time to prepare for what they'd see. The neighborhoods they passed looked exactly the same as they always had. Houses with raked leaves. Kids' bicycles on porches. The ordinary machinery of suburban life grinding forward, indifferent to the fact that 4 blocks over, an entire street had just been turned inside out. When they turned onto Meadow Lane, the first thing Helen noticed was the absence. The police vehicles were gone. The evidence vans had left. The yellow tape remained across the Callaway garage and the DeLuca front door, but the street itself had been returned to its residents, and most of those residents had gone back inside and closed their doors. 26 Meadow Lane sat waiting for them, the way a patient waits in a hospital bed. Damaged but present, changed but standing. Walt pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. They sat in the car for a while looking at the front of their house. The porch was gone. Just gone. Where Walt had built the railing and Helen had hung the seasonal wreath and Maria had sat reading on summer evenings. There was now a scorched gap, like a missing tooth in a familiar face. The front windows were boarded with plywood. The siding above the door was blackened and buckled. But the house stood. "Back door," Walt said. They walked around the side, past the gate with its broken latch that had started all of this. Through the yard where Helen's garden beds sat undisturbed under their winter mulch, and up the steps of the deck Walt had spent 3 summers building. Helen ran her hand along the railing, solid, unburned, still here. The back door opened with the same stubborn resistance it had always had. The slight swelling of the wood that Walt had been meaning to plane for 5 years and never had. Inside, the kitchen was intact. Cold, because the heat had been off for 2 weeks, and there was a faint smell of smoke that had crept through the house like an unwelcome guest. But the yellow cabinets were fine. The door frame where Maria and then Sophia had stood for their annual height measurements was untouched. The pencil marks climbing upward through the years like a timeline of everything good that had happened here. Helen walked through the kitchen into the hallway and stopped. The living room was the boundary. Beyond the hallway, everything changed. The front half of the house was a ruin of charred furniture, water-damaged walls, and the particular devastation that fire leaves behind. Not just destruction, but transformation. Things that had been one thing were now something else. The couch was a frame of twisted springs. The bookshelf was a blackened skeleton. Walt's recliner, the one he'd refused to replace for 15 years despite Helen's lobbying, was a lump of melted fabric and scorched foam. Helen stood at the edge of the damage and looked at it. She expected grief. She braced for it on the drive over, tightened herself against the wave that she assumed would come when she saw the full extent of what had been done. But standing there, in the cold hallway of her wounded house, what she felt was something different. Clarity. The living room was furniture. The porch was wood. The front windows were glass. All of it was replaceable, rebuildable, replantable. The things that mattered. The height marks on the door frame, the garden beds with their dormant roots, the deck where she and Walt drank coffee every morning from May to October, those things had survived. And the things that mattered most. The footage, the notebook, the ledger that had exposed a $2 million criminal network operating behind smiles and tomatoes and birthday pies. Those things had never been in the house at all. They'd been with Helen. In her hands, in her head, in the stubborn, pattern-reading, number-balancing mind that 34 years of bookkeeping had sharpened into something nobody had thought to fear. "It's bad," Walt said from behind her, looking at the living room. "It's fixable," Helen said, and she meant it. The next 3 weeks moved at the particular pace of the aftermath. Insurance adjusters came and measured and photographed and filled out forms that Helen reviewed with the intensity of someone who had not spent 34 years watching other people get the numbers wrong just to let it happen to her now. The contractor Walt hired, a man named Glenn who'd been recommended by the fire department, assessed the damage and gave them a timeline. 3 months to rebuild the front of the house. New porch, new windows, new living room walls and floor. The structure was sound, Glenn said. The bones were good. Built things right back then, Glenn told Walt, knocking on a support beam that had survived the fire without so much as a char mark. "Don't see framing like this anymore. My wife picked this house," Walt said. "She doesn't pick things that fall apart easy." Helen, who was standing close enough to hear, said nothing. But she wrote Glenn a check for the deposit without negotiating, which was Helen's version of a compliment. They moved back into the house on the 4th day after returning, living in the back half while the front was gutted and rebuilt. It was cramped and strange, sleeping in the guest bedroom, cooking in a kitchen that smelled faintly of smoke no matter how many times Helen scrubbed the walls. But it was home, damaged, diminished, but theirs. The criminal case unfolded in the background like a slow-moving storm. Claudia provided updates when she could, careful to share only what was public record or directly relevant to Helen and Walt as victims of the arson. The fencing network had been operating across 3 neighborhoods, with Meadow Lane as the central hub. Goods stolen from warehouses, shipping facilities, and retail chains were brought to the Anderson house for intake, moved to the Callaway garage for repackaging and documentation removal, and stored in the DeLuca basement before distribution to buyers across 2 states. Keith Anderson, it turned out, had been recruited by a larger organization shortly after inheriting his parents' house. His logistics company was the front, and the house's location in a quiet cul-de-sac made it ideal. The neighbors were old, settled, unobservant, or so he'd assumed. Tommy DeLuca had brought his uncle into the operation by offering to pay off Frank's mounting medical bills in exchange for use of the basement. Frank, facing surgery he couldn't afford and too proud to ask his neighbors for help, had agreed. Helen thought about that for a long time. Frank DeLuca, carrying shingles up a ladder, handing over tomatoes, smiling at block parties, all while drowning in debt he never mentioned. She didn't forgive him, but she understood the shape of the hole he'd fallen into, even if she couldn't excuse the choices he'd made inside it. Dolores Calloway was the one Helen thought about most. Claudia confirmed what Helen had suspected. Dolores was the network's eyes on Meadow Lane, her position as the street's most dedicated observer, the curtain watcher, the schedule tracker, the woman who always knew who was home and who wasn't, had made her invaluable. She monitored neighbor routines, flagged changes in patterns, and provided the intelligence that kept the operation invisible. She'd been doing it for over 2 years. 2 years of pie deliveries and birthday cards and small talk about weather, all of it layered on top of a second purpose. Every conversation with Helen about vacation plans or evening walks, or when the girls were visiting, had been data collection. Every friendly wave had been surveillance. Helen sat with that knowledge the way you sit with a stone in your shoe. It didn't cripple her. It didn't stop her from walking. But she felt it with every step. A small, persistent reminder that the surface of things was never the whole story. Dolores was not arrested. Her cooperation with the task force earned her a deal that kept her out of handcuffs, though the terms were sealed and Claudia couldn't share the details. The arson investigation, which was separate, moved more slowly. The individual captured on Helen's camera setting the fire was identified as a man named Victor Solis, a hired contractor with no direct connection to Meadow Lane. He'd been paid to destroy the Garza house, and the task force was working to determine who had authorized it. Helen believed she already knew, but she kept that belief in her notebook alongside the dates and plate numbers and timestamps and waited for the evidence to catch up with her instincts. In the meantime, she rebuilt, not just the house, something quieter and harder to name. The first Sunday after they moved back in, Helen went out to the front yard to assess the garden beds. The fire had scorched the grass nearest the porch, leaving a brown, dead patch that extended almost to the walkway. The heat had wilted the closest shrubs, and a fine layer of ash coated everything within 15 feet of where the porch had stood. But the hydrangeas were farther out, planted along the walkway. 20 feet from the house in the beds Helen had dug and amended and tended for 3 decades. She knelt beside them, ignoring the protest of her knees on the cold ground, and brushed the ash away from the base of the nearest plant. The stems were brown and dry, as they always were in November, but beneath the surface where her fingers pressed into the mulch, the root crown was firm, not mushy, not dead, dormant, waiting. "They'll come back," she said to nobody. She spent the morning cleaning the beds, raking ash, pulling dead annuals. Spreading a fresh layer of mulch, she'd asked Glenn's crew to leave beside the driveway. It was slow, careful work, the kind that let your hands do one thing while your mind did another. Mrs. Pham from the house at the end of the street, the only neighbor Helen hadn't connected to the operation, walked past and stopped. "Helen? I didn't know you were back. Got home a few days ago." Mrs. Pham looked at the boarded windows, the scorched siding, the absent porch. Her face did that complicated thing that faces do when they're trying to express sympathy without saying the wrong thing. "I'm so sorry about what happened." We were all shocked. "Were you?" Helen said, and immediately regretted the edge in her voice. Mrs. Pham blinked. "Of course nobody expects something like this. And then the police, the arrests. I still don't understand what was happening." Helen softened. Mrs. Pham was 74, lived alone since her husband passed, and spent most of her time on video calls with her grandchildren in California. If anyone on Meadow Lane was genuinely innocent and genuinely shocked, it was her. "I'm sorry," Helen said. "It's been a difficult month. Can I bring you anything? I made soup yesterday." Too much for one person. Helen looked at this woman, this neighbor she'd known for 2 decades and never paid much attention to, offering soup in the November cold to a woman whose house had been burned and whose trust had been shattered. Such a small thing, such an ordinary human thing. "Soup would be nice," Helen said. "Thank you, Mrs. Pham brought the soup that evening. She stayed for an hour, sitting in the kitchen with Helen and Walt, talking about nothing important. Her grandchildren, a book she'd just finished, the new bakery that had opened on Birch Street. Normal conversation. The kind Helen hadn't had in weeks and didn't realize she'd been starving for until it was in front of her. After Mrs. Pham left, Walt washed the soup bowls and set them in the drying rack. She's good people, he said she is. Helen agreed. Not everyone was in on it. No, not everyone. Walt dried his hands on the dish towel and hung it on the hook by the sink. The same hook, the same towel, the same small domestic gesture he'd made 10,000 times in this kitchen. I've been thinking about Frank. Helen waited. Not about what he did, about before. About the years when he was just Frank. The tomatoes. The roof. Helping me move that boulder out of the backyard when Maria wanted a swing set. He paused. Were those things real? Or was all of it part of the cover? It was the question Helen had been avoiding, the one that lived underneath all the timestamps and plate numbers and ledger entries, the question that no amount of documentation could answer. I think they were real, she said slowly. I think Frank was a good neighbor for 26 years, and then he became a desperate man who made a terrible choice. I think both things are true, and I think that's harder than if he'd been pretending the whole time. Walt considered this. It is harder, because it means good people can do bad things. We already knew that. Knowing it and watching it happen on your own street are different animals, Walt. He hung the towel straight, adjusting it the way he always did, both sides even, centered on the hook. I don't want to hate him, he said. I just want to understand how he got there. You might not get that. I know. They stood in the kitchen in the quiet that comes after big conversations, the kind of quiet that isn't empty but full, packed with everything that was said and everything that wasn't. Helen reached for the light switch, then stopped. Walt? Yeah, the porch. When Glenn rebuilds it, I want it wider. He looked at her. Wider, she repeated. Enough room for 2 chairs and a small table. I want to sit out there in the mornings with my coffee and see the whole street. He understood, not just the practical request, the declaration underneath it. Helen Garza was not retreating. She was not drawing the curtains and hiding behind locked doors and letting what had happened make her smaller. She was expanding, taking up more space, seeing more, not less. I'll tell Glenn tomorrow, Walt said, and a light, Helen added. A good one, the kind that lights up the whole yard. Motion activated? No, permanent. On all night. Walt smiled. That slow, lopsided thing that Helen had fallen in love with 47 years ago in the parking lot of a dance hall, where neither of them could dance and both of them pretended they could. All night, he confirmed. Winter settled over Meadow Lane with the indifference that weather has for human drama. Snow came and went. The construction crew worked through the cold, framing the new porch, hanging new siding, replacing the windows with double-paned glass that Glenn said would hold up better than the originals. Helen and Walt lived in the back of the house and watched the front come back to life. The legal proceedings continued. Keith Anderson pled guilty in December to charges related to the fencing operation. Tommy DeLuca cooperated with prosecutors and received a reduced sentence. Frank DeLuca, whose involvement was limited to providing the basement in exchange for medical bill payments, was charged separately and released on his own recognizance pending trial. Helen saw him once getting his mail, moving slowly, looking 20 years older than he had in September. He didn't wave. She didn't either. Dolores Calloway's house went dark in January. Not the operational kind of dark, not the blue-white glow of illicit activity, just dark, empty. A for sale sign appeared in the yard on a Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday Dolores was gone. No goodbye, no forwarding address. Just the sign and the silence and the memory of teacups and pies and 26 years of watching. Helen walked past the house on her way to the mailbox and looked at it. The curtains Dolores had watched from were still hanging in the front window. The garden she'd maintained, never as carefully as Helen's but maintained nonetheless, was already starting to look neglected. Helen kept walking. Some things didn't require a second look. In February, the arson investigation concluded. Victor Solis, the man captured on Helen's camera, was charged with first-degree arson. The investigation confirmed that the fire had been ordered by a coordinator within the larger fencing network, someone above the street-level operation who had determined that the Garza property represented an unacceptable security risk. Dolores Calloway's role in identifying that risk and recommending action was noted in the case file, though Claudia said the legal implications of that recommendation were still being evaluated. Helen read the case summary 3 times. Then she closed the folder, placed it in the filing cabinet she kept in the guest bedroom, and labeled it the way she labeled everything, clearly, precisely, with the confidence of a woman who knew that the numbers in the end always told the truth. March came in raw and wet, the kind of early spring that feels more like winter's last argument than anything hopeful. But the porch was finished. Glenn and his crew had built it wider, just as Helen asked. Cedar planks properly sealed, with a railing Walt had requested be made from the same wood as the original. The steps were broader, the overhang deeper, and at the corner nearest the street, a permanent light fixture that glowed warm white from dusk to dawn every night without exception. Helen placed 2 chairs on the porch the day it was finished, not new chairs. She'd found them at a second-hand shop on Birch Street, wooden rockers with faded blue paint that reminded her of something she couldn't quite name. She positioned them side by side, angled slightly toward the street, with a small table between them just big enough for 2 coffee cups. The first morning warm enough to sit outside, she and Walt carried their mugs to the porch and settled into the rockers. The street was quiet. Mrs. Pham waved from her yard. A family Helen didn't recognize had moved into the Calloway house, a young couple with a toddler and a golden retriever that was already digging up the neglected garden. The Anderson house was still empty, for sale, like the Calloway house before it, though Helen doubted it would sell quickly. Houses with criminal histories tended to linger on the market, their pasts clinging to them like the faint smell of smoke that still sometimes drifted through 26 Meadow Lane on humid days. Helen sipped her coffee and watched the street, not the way she'd watched from the motel room, hungry for evidence, scanning for threats. Not the way Dolores had watched, cataloging patterns for someone else's benefit, just watching. The way a person watches a place they've chosen to stay, a place they've earned the right to know fully, surface and depth, the seen and the unseen. Walt rocked slowly in his chair, his bad knee stretched out, his coffee balanced on the armrest with the casual precision of long practice. "Quiet morning," he said. "Good quiet," Helen said. He glanced at her. "Are you going to keep the cameras?" Helen had thought about that. The 4 cameras were still active, still recording to the cloud, still capturing every movement on and around their property. She hadn't turned them off since the day she'd installed them, and part of her resisted the idea. The cameras had saved them, had saved their case, had been the difference between being dismissed and being believed. But another part of her, the part that wanted to sit on this porch and just be here, not surveilling but inhabiting, that part had an opinion too. "I'll keep 2, she said. "Back door and side gate. The rest come down." "What about the street view?" Helen looked out at Meadow Lane. The new family's toddler was chasing the golden retriever across the Calloway yard, shrieking with the kind of joy that has no past and no agenda. Mrs. Pham was sweeping her walkway. A mail truck turned the corner and began its unhurried route. "I've got the porch for that," Helen said. Walt nodded. He understood the way he always eventually understood Helen's decisions, that this wasn't about lowering her guard. It was about choosing what she watched and why. The cameras had been necessary. The porch was something else. The porch was choice, presence. A woman deciding that the best surveillance system ever invented was a comfortable chair, a cup of coffee, and the willingness to pay attention. Helen set her mug on the table and leaned back in the rocker. The spring air carried the raw, wet smell of thawing earth and the first green hints of things coming back to life. Somewhere beneath the mulch in her garden beds, the hydrangea roots were waking up, pushing energy upward through dormant stems, preparing to do what they'd done every year for 31 years. "Bloom, despite everything. Bloom anyway, Walt," Helen said after a while. "Yeah. Next time we pretend to go on vacation, let's actually go." He laughed. "The real one, the one she'd married." "Sarasota?" he asked. "Sarasota," she confirmed. They sat on the porch, rocking slowly, watching their street become itself again. Not the street they'd thought they knew, not the street that had hidden so much behind its ordinary face, but the street as it actually was, complicated and imperfect and full of people making choices. Some good, some terrible, most somewhere in the uncertain middle, where real life happens. Helen Garza had spent 34 years reading numbers. She'd spent 31 years reading a street. And in 2 weeks in a motel room with 2 laptops and a notebook, she'd read the truth that nobody else had been willing to see, not because she was special, not because she had training or authority or any of the things people assume you need to uncover what's hidden in plain sight, because she was paying attention. That's all it ever was. A woman who refused to stop paying attention, even when the world told her she was too old, too ordinary, too invisible to matter, especially then. The light on the porch stayed on that night as it would every night from now on. Warm and steady, reaching across the yard and onto the street, making visible what had once been dark. Not a searchlight, not a warning, just a light. Left on by someone who understood that the simplest way to fight what hides in the dark is to make sure the dark has nowhere left to hide.